Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Michael Kugelman, Program Associate for South Asia with the Wilson Center's Asia Program. Thanks for coming. I'd also like to thank the STAGE program, known in its longhand form as the Program on Science, Technology, America, and the Global Economy. STAGE is co-sponsoring today's meeting, and Ken Hughes is here. Thank you, Ken. Well, there are few people in Washington who know more about India than Ray Vickery, in our view. And the Wilson Center is very fortunate to have had him here with us as a public policy scholar for the last few months. And today Ray will be talking about his Wilson Center project, which deals with the U.S.-India economic relationship, something he's focused on quite deeply in recent years. You should have his bio in front of you, so I'll be brief as I highlight some of the things he's done in recent years. In addition to being a public policy scholar here, he's a senior vice president with Stonebridge International, where he played a leading role in the passage of the U.S.-India civil nuclear deal. He's got he's 40 years of experience with India, and for the past 15 years he's been deeply involved in the strategic aspects of U.S.-India economic engagement. Previously, he served as Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Trade Development in the first Bill Clinton administration, and he was also given responsibility for India while carrying out the Commerce Department's Big Emerging Markets initiative. So I will turn things over to Ray. He's going to speak, and then following his presentation, he'll be happy to take your questions.
Thanks very much, Michael. I appreciate it, and I want to thank all of you for coming, but I'd be remiss if I didn't recognize two very special guests that we have here. I never understood why when people wrote books, they always thanked their wives in the introduction, but now with my wife, Ann, I understand because it's been her support that's made this all possible. Another very special guest we have is my mother. Michael has accused me of packing the audience with family members, but I won't tell you how old my mom is, but she'll be 91 on the 22nd of May, and she runs a school with 250 kids and 24 teachers every day and gets up and goes to do it. And, Mom, I think it's true that everything I ever really need to know you learned in kindergarten. And so I think that is what we can all shoot for. I want to thank Lee Hamilton and Michael Van Dusen for the opportunity to be here. They're great leaders. Just to go in and be able to have lunch with them at the Wilson Center is a real privilege and always a learning experience. Bob Hathaway, you know, as the head of the Asia program here. He and Kent Hughes from Science, Technology, and the Global Economy have been my mentors. We started talking about this. They said it was all possible if I would provide a case of the right kind of wine from Tuscany for each of them. And
we have not yet received.
Don't worry, the wine's in the mail. It's going to come. And I also want to thank Rory Lynn, who's here, who's my research assistant and has been so very, very helpful. And it has been really an inspiration in terms of keeping on slogging on this. Well, this is very much a work in progress kind of presentation, although every time I say that, Bob Hathaway says, oh, no, you got to really produce something today, and there'll be really consequences if you don't. But the fact is we're about halfway or so into this, and I look to the scholars that are here. I see Dennis Cooks, who's here, and Bill Milam, who all know about South Asia and other eminent people, and I look forward to getting your input. That's my goal here in terms of what we're doing and how it can be done better. Well, what is this project all about, and why am I doing it? The project is about the strategic aspects of U.S.-India economic engagement. And why am I doing it is perhaps indicated in part by what Mike was saying in terms of my background. I first went to India in 1964 and 65, and I was doing research in regard to the role of the press in the politics of South Asia. And one of the things that I found out pretty early on was one of the reasons that what was happening with the press was so important in the politics of South Asia. Had nothing to do with the fact that there was editorial comment and there was news reporting, but it had to do with the fact that the press and publication was one of the most successful business and economic endeavors at that time. And from that, I took with me a point that became a key point in what I did after that. I had a couple of Indian American clients when I was practicing law at Hogan and Hartson, but I really got deeply into this issue at the Commerce Department. We had a big emerging markets strategy, you may remember, with Ron Brown and Jeff Garton. And we had simply picked the top 10. Ellis Motter is here. He was, and I worked on this at the time. They picked the top 10 developing markets. And at that time, India was put on the list, much to the surprise of a lot of people. And they went around the room, well, who knows anything about India? And I happened to raise my hand because I'd been out there on a Fulbright. And they said, okay, Ray, you get India is a big emerging market. And shortly thereafter, we went off to India to prepare for Ron Brown's trip out there in '95, which at that time, it's hard to believe now, but at that time that was a really big deal to have a secretary at a ministerial level come and talk about economic engagement. One of the things that I was struck by when I was out there was that people would talk about what is going to happen in terms of the political context for this activity. And I saw that there was an interrelationship, and rather than go back to the practice of law, I was fortunate first on my own and then with Stonebridge to be working in this area, and particularly working on in the area of sanctions, both in '98 and then with what happened after that in bringing India into the rest of the world in regard to civil nuclear trade. So this is the thesis that economic engagement has important impacts on U.S.-India strategic relations. Just a few definitional matters. When we talk about strategic, we're not just talking about defense and military kind of strategic matters, but rather ability to cooperate on areas that have broad transnational importance. I'll come to those categories in a few minutes. By economic engagement, we don't mean just trade and investment, but the whole panoply of economic engagement factors, including lending, aid, macroeconomic cooperation, which has become so important. And I think it's very important, as we'll see in one of the case studies, to break down each of these categories. There's a very great difference when you're talking trade in goods as opposed to trade in services. In investment, talking about foreign direct investment, which is generally viewed much more favorably than foreign institutional investment or portfolio investment. In regard to lending, public sources and private sources have very different implications for the borrower in terms of what the relationship is and what the impact is. When you talk about aid, you're talking about not just what happens with USAID and that economic relationship, but the whole area now that Bill Gates and others have been involved in which has to do with what the private sector does in that area. By impacts, I think it's very important to recognize that it's an interactive process, that it's never in terms of a straight line kind of impact. I've designated the relationship in terms of feedback loops. And if you look at feedback loops, I think you can see that if you have economic engagement both on the U.S. side and then on the India side, that will have an impact on electorates, which then goes to U.S. officials, which will then have an impact back on economic engagement. So it's really a loop, and within each of these there is another loop. It may be that U.S. officials are affected directly by how they see economic engagement, and even in terms of how the officials interact among themselves. And those loops can either be virtuous, that is positive, or they can be very negative. And once you start it in one way or another, it's very difficult then to get it back, if you're in a negative feedback loop, to get it back into a virtuous feedback of positive of kinds of relationships. Now, what are the questions that we're trying to look at? And I guess you could put these into the categories of descriptive and then normative and then prescriptive in terms of what the prescription ought to be. What is the impact? Good, bad, large, small? I don't think you have to be a Marxist to believe that economic relations have a significant impact. I would, not being a Marxist, wouldn't say that's not a controlling relationship. On the other hand, it's not a sort of Friedrich Nietzsche will to power kind of situation in which the economy really doesn't have much to do with it, but it has to do with the people's power aims and the control that they want to exercise. So first of all, I think we'll try to do some descriptive work. The second question is a bit more interesting, and that is what should be the impact of economic relations on strategic matters. One of the things that I was very much struck by at the Department of Commerce when we went in as a Democratic administration is how much more willing we were to work in terms of using economic factors in regard to international public policy than the previous administration. You always associate, I think, business and commerce more with Republican administrations. But the reality was that the Republican administration, which we came after, had very much a view that the market should take care of itself. That there should not be interference, and that was the best way to have a positive impact in terms of it. Well, that is a question, it seems to me, as to what it should be. I don't think anybody would advocate that matters of great international political importance, particularly on the strategic areas, should be controlled by what the economic relationship is. But on the other hand, it seems to be a bit of turning a blind eye if you do not recognize that the economic relationship is going to be a forcing factor in many instances as to what will happen down the line in some of the categories we're going to talk about. And then the final question, or the third question, is if you take the position that there is a relationship, and two, there should be a relationship, what would be the policy implications for a U.S. administration particularly in terms of how it ought to relate those two factors of the economic relationship and what happens in terms of political and strategic matters. And I'll come back to those questions at the end of my introductory remarks and before we get into what I view as the main purpose of this, as I said earlier, which is the questions and answers and inputs I can get from you. I will do a little bit of background work in this book. I think it's important to recognize that these matters have both strong historic roots, and that there is a context in both relative size and importance and the characteristics of sectors which make a great difference in how you analyze what the strategic impact is of economic relations between U.S. and India. As you can see on the slide, we've talked about three historic areas: pre-independence, that's pre-India independence. I was very much interested to find out that the first U.S. consulate established in India was established on November the 19th, 1792 in Calcutta. It was the second consulate ever established by the United States government. The one in Mumbai wasn't much behind in 1832. So we usually think of the interaction as only having occurred in the modern era, but that's not quite true. What is very true, of course, is that after independence, there really wasn't much that went on, particularly went on in a positive way, between the United States on the economic scene. There are a lot of reasons for that, which Dennis and others have elucidated, but suffice it to say that with both the values of Nehru in regard to Fabian socialism, which he'd picked up in Britain, in the context of a Cold War, that the economic relationship was not one that was positive. This changed in 1991, as has been said in many other works of scholarship, because India was really forced to the wall in terms of what its economic situation was. It was down to about 3 weeks' worth of foreign exchange. The country was about to go bankrupt. And at that time, the man who is the President Prime Minister, Manmohan Singh, with the Prime Minister Rao, said we got to do things differently. And from that point on, there was a turn toward the market, albeit with a great overhang of governmental intervention and top-down involvement. But things began to move, and it was in that context that the matters that I was talking to you about, and we'll come back to in the mid-'90s, started to move, and so they started to have an impact in terms of what the strategic relationship was between the United States and India. Now, the methodology of this book is going to be case studies. I'm not an economist. I'm a lawyer, politician, and we have only an ability to do what we can do, and that is to look at this on a case-by-case basis. But I think that this can be helpful in answering, making comments on the three questions that I put forward earlier. Again, the purpose here in looking at this as strategic aspects is not just to look at that first category of military and political security, but look to what happens in economic security and development. And I'll come back to the concept of what I would view as majority prosperity, or what the Indians talk about as inclusive growth, as being key there. environmental and energy security, very much linked. And then the final category, health security, which I think has been very much influenced in the U.S.-India context by what's happened in intellectual property, and particularly patents in the pharmaceutical area. This is a little bit longer list of what I intend to do in regard to the case studies. Those first three I just mentioned very briefly because I want to come back to them, and they'll be the burden of what I'll say for the rest of these opening remarks. Hyde Act, it seems to me, is archetypical in terms of a story, a case study around which a lot of different concepts can be based in terms of examining these questions. This, of course, was the act which allowed for civil nuclear cooperation between U.S. and India, but had predecessor activities were very much influenced by what the economic relationship, and then had follow-on, which particularly in the defense field, in the area of defense acquisition, have been obvious and very important. The second category really is one having to do with a topic which is very much in the news in regard to outsourcing and H-1B visas. I'll come back to that. The third case study having to do with the aftermath of what happened when terrorists attacked the Indian Parliament on December the 13th, 2001. The other chapters in the book, I mentioned meltdown and how important that is now in terms of what the U.S. and India are doing. I think it's very significant that the very first meeting between President Obama and the Prime Minister of India, Manmohan Singh, took place on the verges of the G20 meeting on April the 2nd, and we'll do some examination of both the places of agreement and disagreement in regard to the approach of the meltdown. The Iran pipeline that has been proposed and has had much more political impact than it will ever have, in my view, economic impact, is a story upon which competition in regard to energy resources will, it seems to me, be brought to life. Kyoto to Copenhagen refers to what happens with the U.S. involvement on the environmental front in regard to global warming and carbon emissions. And Copenhagen, of course, being the meeting scheduled for later this year, in which there is to be a successor agreement reached. Now, on the negative side, perhaps, this chapter on Dabhol and the fast track and electric power interchange, it seems to me, can be quite instructive of what I was calling as the negative feedback loop as opposed to a virtuous feedback loop. And what this refers to, of course, is the Enron project near the village of Dabhol in Maharashtra state, which came to a very disastrous denouement in the sense that it sits there rusting, putting out some electric power, but has never fulfilled any of the original concept of being able to use gas from the Middle East to promote clean energy as well as more abundant energy. Unfortunately, it was the lead project of something called the Fast Track program, which had been put together by a minister of power that I worked with quite closely, N.K.P. Salvi, And that story, it seems to me, will elucidate how, if you don't get it right, the ability of two nations, in this case India and the U.S., to cooperate in regard to energy and therefore in regard to environment and what happens in terms of emissions is very much hurt. Green revolution may be back to where I got started in this business. When I was first out in India in '64, my dad arranged for me to stay with the agricultural attaché at the embassy, U.S. embassy, a fellow named Bowler at that time. And he was really fully involved with the Rockefeller Foundation folks in regard to the green revolution, which we know now to have been a success in increasing yields and has had a very great impact. There's been a lot of talk about a second green revolution and U.S.-India involvement on that. It's never happened. In my view, it's never happened because the economic underpinnings changed. It is impossible to do that kind of second green revolution without a interdependence and interaction in regard to the people who are in the private sector. And that hasn't been recognized, particularly on the India side, and the engagement has never taken place which would support that kind of second green revolution. Doha, you might also look at as a negative feedback loop, and you've seen in the papers the great difficulty that the U.S. and India have had to coming together in this area, in the area of the multilateral trade agreement. It too has been impacted very much by what happens in regard to agriculture. Kamal Nath, as many of you know, is the Minister of Commerce and Industry in India and the lead negotiator and really a thorn in the side of Susan Schwab and other U.S. Negotiators. And Kamal Nath has what he calls the $1 deal. And the deal is, if the United States will reduce its agricultural subsidies by $1, then he will agree to everything else the U.S. wants. And that deal has never been taken up. And why hasn't it been taken up? Because of the economic interest in terms of the engagement in regard to what happens in that crucial area. In regard to the Indus project, that's a project on child labor. You remember the Reebok case in which Reebok was accused of using child labor, and that has had an impact in regard to that issue. AIDS and IPR, this is what my wife Ann knows about more than I do. Intellectual property, the engagement of pharmaceutical companies between the U.S. and India has both helped in terms of what you might see with the Clinton Foundation and other initiatives by the Bush administration in fighting AIDS, and it's also hurt because of disagreements over what it means to protect IPR and where the public interest lies. And finally, in regard to open skies, infrastructure, as those of you who deal with India know, is fundamental and paramount to progress. And the fact that the U.S. and India aviation industries could get together, then got the governments together, which in turn has had a virtuous feedback, if you will, in terms of what happens in the construction of economic infrastructure. Now, and Rory told me this would happen, taking too much time on these, I'd like to just concentrate for a few minutes on three of these basic stories or case studies that I've done the most work on so far. I think that many in this room are very familiar with what I would say sad history of U.S.-India economic engagement in regard to nuclear matters, starting with Atoms for Peace in the 50s, which India was one of the chief countries to take up that promise. And then the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, coming along, and India refusing to enter into that. I think that it's important in regard to this question that there be an understanding of what I believe to be fundamental to U.S.-India relations, and an aspect which the United States has not really fully appreciated. And that is that India has a legacy of a colonial experience, which still is the background for so much in terms of what happens politically. And India took the position from the very start in regard to nuclear matters that it was an equal to any great power. And that was fundamental to India's view as of itself. Everybody remembers what Nehru said in regard to the independence of India. A moment comes, which comes but rarely in history, when we step out from the old to the new, when an age in and when the soul of a nation long suppressed finds utterance. And it is that soul of a nation long suppressed finding utterance, which it seems to me is the key part of that, particularly in the context of what we're trying to do here. In 1998, I was just out of the Commerce Department, and I picked a great time to go into U.S.-India economic and business matters, because the Indians tested a nuclear device, and immediately sanctions and what's called the Glenn Amendment kicked in, and the whole area of U.S.-India economic matters went into a very difficult period. In 2000, I was privileged for the U.S.-India Business Council to be involved with President Clinton's trip that really brought a close to that era. And that era was one in which we found in the United States that this approach of economic sanctions just did not work, and does not work in that area. I was then privileged later on to be able to work on the civil nuclear matter. And what happened in regard to the Hyde Act. The Hyde Act being the Henry J. Hyde United States-India Peaceful Atomic Energy Cooperation Act of 2006, which brought an end to the whole isolation of India in regard to civil nuclear. I think what most people don't recognize is two things. One, that the roots for being able to do this occurred in regard to U.S.-India economic relations. And those roots were laid down after 9/11 in something called the High-Tech Cooperation Group, which was set up. And that in turn led to what's called the Next Steps in Strategic Partnership, which was really an emphasis on what are the restraints for the whole question of high-tech trade. And it was from that then the Bush administration, George W. Bush and Manmohan Singh, were able to step out into the Rose Garden on July the 18th, 2005, and announced that there was an agreement to move forward. I was then involved in rallying the economic forces in regard to what would happen to that initiative. And we put together a coalition for partnership with India, which consisted of the business community, Indian Americans, and the policy community. And what I intend to do in this particular chapter is to go through what the interrelationships were in regard to the economic aspect of this, and then what happened on the Hill. And you'll see there the various factors in that regard. The next chapter would be on H-1B visas and outsourcing, economic development. And here it seems to me, first of all, important to recognize that the role of services is fundamental to the relationship, the economic trade in services. And that, in turn, brings in the question of what happens in regard to H-1B visas. Now, I don't want people's eyes to glaze over any more than they might already be glazing over, but just suffice it to say at this time that the H-1B category is the non-immigrant category, which is absolutely fundamental from an Indian perspective to being able to deliver services in the high-tech computer services area into the United States. And in regard to the political argument, and here's where I take great inspiration from Kent Hughes and his latest book on Building the Next American Century, The Past and Future of Economic Competitiveness. If you look at the definition of what competitiveness is as put forward by the Presidential Council on Industrial Competitiveness, it contains each of the factors which it seems to me are fundamental in this argument at this time. And the fundamentals are, one, on the side of why you have outsourcing, the ability for U.S. companies to be able to compete worldwide. As you see in any time you get underneath the hood of the delivery of services, you find out that it is impossible to say, well, we have a U.S. service product here, and then we have a foreign service product. The fact is that if you're going to meet the test of international markets, you're going to have to be able to source worldwide. At the same time, and this is the second part of this definition, maintaining or expanding the real incomes of people is the important part. And there's no question, if you look at the models, that overall there is the economic flows are there, which are positive on both sides, but the question is who gets what, when, where, and how. It's back to that. And you see that now in coming to the forefront in the politics of both the United States and India. In the United States, we're calling this what happens to the middle class and whether or not they're benefited by international trade. In India, it's called inclusive growth. and whether or not there is participation in the India shining sort of story by people who are the majority of the people. And what the BJP coalition found out to its sorrow in 2004 was it wasn't enough to be India shining. They lost. And now the question, as you know, elections are going on right now in India. And the question again is who's benefiting from this? And so I think it's very important to take a look at this. In my own experience, and it goes back to 2004, when there was a coalition put together which had to do with the whole question of outsourcing, and it was then met by factors on both sides, both for and against. Now, what has happened, as many of you know, is that in the stimulus package, this issue has been taken up in Section 1611, which has the short title of Employ American Workers Act. And basically what that says is, in regard to H-1B, the presumption that the United States needed temporary workers in this area isn't enough. The presumption that you need it and the quota to get 65,000 now plus 20,000 isn't enough. And what has to happen if you're going to take TARP funds is that you're going to have to go the extra mile and prove that you're not displacing American workers. Well, I can tell you that this is not going to be a small issue. It's not a small issue now, and it was discussed by the President and the Prime Minister in their meeting in London, and it will continue to reverberate in the politics of both sides and make it either more difficult or easier to work on questions about inclusive growth or what happens to the middle class, what you can do in increasing prosperity depending on how that issue is handled. The third story that I want to talk about, well, just Rory reminds me I haven't talked about just the importance of the services trade, and I want to show just a few slides on that. I'll do it quickly. This is what you usually hear about when you talk about U.S.-India trade, the blue, and that is trade in goods. And you very seldom hear or see any numbers about what the trade in services is. And it's very difficult to find those, and you never really find them. In fact, I've never seen this in which they are aggregated. And you will see that you're missing about 50% of the story if you don't look at services. Now, on the next one, it becomes even more important in terms of what the political impact is when you start to look at IT and IT-enabled services. And you can see here why it is that in the 2008 elections, this became a really big political issue, because there wasn't much of an issue. There was something in 2004, but this is this is the U.S. view of it. These are U.S. figures. But if you look at the next slide, this is the India. This is NASCOM, and you remember that figure for 2007 was about $4 billion here. Now you look at the way the Indians look at it. It's 19 to 24 billion. Now, who's right and who's wrong about what the impact is? And I won't bore you with how you might reconcile this. But my point is this, that if you're going to look at outsourcing, if you're going to look at competitiveness, and you're going to look at what impact it has on the U.S.-India relationship, you better start looking at some of these numbers as opposed to just looking to what comes out from U.S. sources. Now, finally, I want to just talk about another chapter in the book which I think perhaps illustrates this relationship more directly than maybe anything else. And for this, I'm indebted to Tom Friedman, who wrote an article back in 2002. And everybody knows about 9/11, but you talk about December 13 to people and what it means in the history of terrorism, and most people just don't know about it. And what happened on that date is that 5 terrorists came into the compound of the parliament in India. They had what looked like a government car. They were dressed in military uniforms, and their aim was to destroy the entire elected leadership of India. And the way they were doing it, they were coming in when both the Lok Sabha and Raj Sabha were in session, they thought, and they were loaded with explosives. There were 5 human bombs. They were going to drive in, and they were going to blow up the whole place. Now, it didn't work out that way because, for one thing, they got there 20 minutes late. They couldn't get through the first line of security. The second thing, there just happened to be the vice president of India's motorcade there, and instead of being able to drive directly into the building, they ran into that motorcade. And at that point, actually a woman constable said, there's something wrong here, and they jumped out of the car and started firing. One of the guys was blown up immediately because a bullet hit part of his suicide vest. All of them were killed. 9 other people were killed. They had been able to shut the gates. But the interesting part about this is not so much that this occurred, which is important enough, but what happened after that. And what happened after that was that India and Pakistan went to war almost. And there were a series of back and forth troop movements, missiles going into places for 2 nuclear-armed neighbors, and at one point, Ambassador Blackwell ordered any non-essential personnel, families out of India, but the war never did take place. And why did that happen? Well, there are a lot of reasons. Of course, there was a lot of pressure put on Musharraf, but one of the most interesting aspects of it is that General Electric decided that this would be bad for business. And General Electric started talking to some of its friends down in Bangalore about what a disaster this would be for economic engagement. And there were a series of contacts made both from the U.S. And the Indian side that had, I believe, and what we will show in this particular chapter, an impact on the question directly of war and peace. And you see there the quote from Friedman, "This ceasefire is brought to you by GE and all its friends here in Bangalore." Well, that may or may not be, in the final analysis, a sufficient view of it, but it certainly was an important part of it. And it seems to me that this will be one useful case study. Now, I'm going to wind up here. I've gone too long, as Rory said I would. but that's life, I guess. Back to the questions again. Of course, we're still dealing with how we want to be able to present answers or commentaries on this, and I'll look forward to getting input from all of you. But I think you can see that economic engagement is not just important, but I'd argue that it's fundamental. And I would also argue in regard to the second question that there should be a relationship that since it does have such an impact, it is foolish to say you're going to let the market take care of itself. It's going to be trade, not aid, and that's all sufficient. Then the real question is the third one. Okay, given that, what is it that the United States government ought to be doing? My argument will be that in regard to every major strategic issue, there ought to be an economic component to what the strategy is of the United States in dealing with that. And that goes for whether it's AFPAC and what happens there. It goes to what happens in regard to fighting pollution. It goes to what happens in regard to health security and right on down the line. And I think that we are missing the boat in the United States largely in our foreign policy strategy by not giving enough credence and enough weight to this aspect of the strategy. I think there is too often in the United States government, and perhaps the ministries of external affairs and foreign affairs around the world, a tendency to look at what happens in regard to the economic aspects of a strategic relationship, to look askance at it. And I think that many of you in this room have seen that happen. If you're talking about guns and bombs and tanks, you get into the front door of the embassy and you go right up, and you go in to see the ambassador or the deputy chief of mission. If you're coming around to talk about what's going to happen on visas and what's going to happen in regard to the economic relationship, you may have to go down to the American Center and talk to somebody down there, and maybe you'll work your way up to a second secretary or an attaché. And I believe that that's all out of proportion to what our ultimate interests are, and that unless we can recognize these early on in the process of what our strategic approach is, we will be very much less successful in meeting any of the strategic challenges facing the United States today. And at that point, I will stop, and I'll look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ray. If you bill this as a work in progress, I think it's clear that you've made a lot of progress in this project. Yeah, let's get to your questions, though. Maybe I'll ask the first question. Given that today is Earth Day, as we all know, I thought I'd ask a question about environmental cooperation. I know that's one of your case studies. A few years ago, the U.S. and India launched an energy dialogue. And more recently, the Obama administration made it clear it's going to make a strong push to combat climate change. Now, at the same time, India has recently given some indications that it probably won't agree to binding emissions cuts, which has got some attention in the last few weeks. So, I'm just curious what's your take on environmental cooperation prospects in the next few months, particularly with the new U.S. administration and a new Indian government coming along eventually too?
Well, you'll not be surprised, Michael, that I think that fundamental to being able to do anything in regard to what happens on the environmental front, the successor to the Kyoto Agreement, will be coming to grips with the economic implications and it will require the use of the economic relations which exist in order to be able to reach some sort of accommodation. And of course, the basic basic problem, of course, is India saying, listen, our use of electricity, the wattage that we use is so small in comparison to yours, and you have built up what is your standard of living by creating more pollution than on a per capita basis than we ever dreamed of creating. So how can you expect us to enter into a relationship in which we agree that we're going to cut back? And then you have, of course, the Congress saying, listen, we're not going to do anything that's useless. I'm taking enough heat from my constituents as it is about doing anything that might affect jobs and economic standards of living. And if you tell me that this can't be solved without India and China doing something, forget it, because what's the point about doing a useless act? I'm an optimist. I think that there are accommodations that can be made, and one of the reasons I'm optimistic about it is the experience in India with polling, which shows that Indians, by and large, are much more willing to take on additional economic burdens to solve pollution problems than are the people in the United States. And that has been borne out by what happened first in Delhi and now in other major cities in regard to conversion to compressed natural gas for public vehicles, which no other metropolitan areas have really been able to do with that success. So I think that there is, as Kamal Nath would say, there's a deal in there somewhere. And I think that it will happen. I don't think it's going to be easy, but I do think that looking to the economic relations is very important. As I indicated in regard to that Dabble situation, one of the reasons I believe that we have so little understanding is because of the great failure of the whole fast-track interaction on the energy side between the U.S. and India. That's been an utter disaster in regard to thermal power development. It hasn't happened. And my view is that if it had happened, we'd have people on both sides of the equation better able to deal with that. So, yeah, I think it can happen. I think something positive will occur now that the president has been willing to put political capital in it, but it's not going to be easy.
Okay, let's go to your questions now. And since we're webcasting this, please wait for a microphone to arrive before you ask your question, and please give your name and affiliation. I understand for some of you that may mean a familial affiliation instead of a professional one, which is fine. But let's start with Dennis.
Dennis Cooks here at the Wilson Center. Ray, congratulations on a terrific presentation.
Thank you.
You really covered an enormous amount of material in a very, very interesting and illuminating way. I think you underscore, though in a way you don't state it directly, how true were the remarks of a former ambassador about 30 years ago, Bob Goheen, who went out to India with a great heart. He was born in India, missionary and what have you. And he said, there's very little going on between the United States and India. There's practically no trade. There's practically no economic relationship. And as a result, when we run into political problems, the ship gets bounced around because there's no ballast. And I think you point out here in the example how this really has steadied this interaction, increasing interaction in the past 20 years, almost 20 years, has really added flesh and bones to or added flesh to a relationship that was pretty bare bones. I wonder if I could ask a question. I wonder if you'd elaborate.
You were doing fine. You don't have to.
Okay. If you'd elaborate a little more on the trade side, the Doha negotiations. You read the American press and they blame the Indians, and you read the Indian papers, and there's et cetera.
I'd be happy to do that. We're both democracies. That's one of the great things in terms of having the possibilities of understanding. And I don't think that I think Minister Nath would say this. Look, we've got to win elections here, and the key to winning elections in India is the 60% of the people who make their living from the land. And if you don't do that, you aren't going to win. And as he has said to me, he said, I understand what your problem is. I mean, you've got senators from farm states, and they're trying to protect their situation there, both in terms of domestic and export. But I think that one of the areas, and this will go not only to the second Green Revolution, but the Doha round, I do think agriculture is a key to it. I think that on the non-agricultural manufacturing sectors negotiations, that is a relatively doable kind of a situation, because there are ways in which the accommodations can be made. But on the agricultural side, it's really fundamental in terms of domestic politics in both India and the U.S. And I think the way in which, one of the ways in which it has to come about that can happen is that you need to get the private sectors involved, the agribusiness sectors. The economic engagement has to be broadened from a view of government-to-government kinds of actions. And that has not occurred. There was an attempt to do it, as you recognize, in the July 18, 2005 statement, the joint statement which really set off the whole initiative on civil nuclear. There's an equally large part about agriculture in there. Well, everybody has focused on what's happened on the nuclear side, but the other, it sort of dropped like a stone. And until that happens, until there is that kind of interaction, it seems to me it's going to be very, very difficult to reach accommodation in such a way. I mean, they're both carrots and sticks. We tend to concentrate on the sticks, it seems to me. If you don't do this, I'm not going to do that. If you don't cut your subsidies, then I'm not going to possibly make a deal over here. And what has to happen, and I think that this is the glory, if you will, of the economic aspect of the strategic planning, is that there can be so much more done, in my view, in regard to the interaction on the agricultural sector, which will then impact what happens in regard to that. But is that going to happen soon? Does that happen quickly? No, it doesn't happen quickly. And so I don't think you ought to look for a deal to be made in regard to Doha anytime soon. I just don't see that there is the economic impetus in the engagement on either side to take that step. There isn't there. And until you do that, I don't see how you get that done. And it seems to me that that's, a shining example of why it is that you have to tend to the economic side of the strategy if you're going to address those strategic problems.
Yes.
Dave Ottaway, a senior scholar here.
My neighbor across the hall.
And a neighbor. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the Iranian pipeline project, which the U.S. government has opposed. Both the Bush administration and I believe the Clinton administration opposed it too. How big an issue did that become, or has it become, between our two governments? Because I can see from India's point of view, they desperately need oil and gas. And were we proposing some other way they could get their gas, and how much pressure did we put on them not to go ahead with that project?
Well, I think, Dave, it's a complicated story, and of course we ran into this in the course of the civil nuclear push and what we were doing with the Coalition for Partnership with India. Chairman Lantos, God rest his soul, was apoplectic about the pipeline. And I can remember going in to seeing him, and he's saying, "Well, gentlemen, what can I do for you?" And we said, "Well, we just want to know how you feel about this, whether you still have the same view." And he's basically said, "I want you to understand very clearly, I don't have any objection to India having relationships with Iran. I have objections to their having relationship with this Iranian government. And if there is any move toward building this pipeline, I will veto this. This will never, ever happen." Now, he passed on, really, before it came to a head. But it's very fundamental. Now, on the other side of it, I mean, in Indian politics, it goes back again to the question about dignity, about respect, about not being just a part of some imperial sort of view. And of course, the leftists have made great gains out of pressing that point in some political context. The other aspect of the pipeline itself is that the pipeline is basically a pipe dream. A pipeline, it ain't going to work, and it won't ever work because of a number of issues. One is just the pure old question of costs in terms of what it costs both to build and the reaching of agreement with Iran and Pakistan on what should be transit charges and so forth. So that is a fundamental factor. Beyond that, the idea that you're really going to be able to get Pakistan under present circumstances and India into a situation in which any part of it can be cut off is hard to see how that will really happen. So it's one of those issues in that regard, and the reason I've chosen it for one of the chapters is that there's so many other issues that can be hung on that question. I think it has been overemphasized. As I say, I don't believe it's going to happen, and yet it remains a very potent political symbol. And it seems to me that, again, the way in which it ought to be dealt with is on an economic basis rather than trying to deal with it as a strategic matter involving the defense of the United States. And I think that's the way in which those issues about Iran and India have to be met.
One more question here, and then we'll move to the other side of the room. Sorry.
Wolf Gross, north of Grumman. Ray, something which you and I were both heavily involved in, and you just mentioned, was the run-up to the 123 agreement. One of the areas that India kept harping about, and indeed continues to harp about, is the reliability of the United States as a supplier, and the time it takes to get approvals of technology transfers. The 123 agreement was a case in point. And one of the ironies of it was that when it finally came to a head and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the international one, approved India as a recipient, it took so long to get licenses here in the United States that the Russians, the Australians, and the Canadians beat us to the punch and made contracts in India that we couldn't touch, that our industry couldn't touch until they got licenses here in the U.S. The issue of reliability of the U.S. as a supplier, are you coming at that in your coverage?
Absolutely, and Wolf, I'm so happy that you're here, and I was happy to be able to work with you on that, and you'll get at least a footnote out of it, Wolf. I'll tell you that. It is the fundamental way in which the whole question of the relationship is cast, and I don't have to tell you that there is a huge trickle-down effect in regard to civil nuclear to all of the other areas, including those which Northrop Grumman is most interested in. And unless you can solve it at the top on the civil nuclear, then each of these other areas in terms of licensing, and this is your area, you know more about it than I do, just don't come about. And that's the reason it was important to take the High Technology Cooperation Group and the next steps in strategic partnership as the fundamental steps to taking the next one in regard to what would happen with civil nuclear. But now, what we need to do is we need to go back to that concept, to reliability of supply, so that we can finish up what was very successful in providing the base and now must be just as successful in providing for the implementation. Because unless you can solve that problem, and it's not just a problem in terms of what happens overall, it is the nuts and bolts of how it works. And the reason this concept of reliability of supply is so important is that the Indian view is that we just flat didn't meet our legal obligations in regard to Tarapur for nuclear fuel. We had a 30-year contract. We did 20 years of it, and then we said, I don't care what the rest of it says. You guys lit off a bomb back then, and even though it was a long time ago, we ain't going to do it. After 1983, there wasn't going to be it. And so continually it comes up. And as I tried to point out when I went back to India in 94, getting ready for Ron Brown's trip, I didn't understand what people were saying when they said, well, what about reliability supply? And what they were talking about is the whole Tarapur experience and what happened there. And so we have to be able to resolve that, and then we can have some of the same sort of positive results that we've gotten thus far, and we've gotten them already out of what happens in regard to the question about civil nuclear engagement. And in that regard, I saw, I don't know whether it's in one of Dennis' books or somebody's, Dave's maybe, it's great to have a little quote before you have each of the chapters. And I wanted you to, this is my quote at this point for the chapter on economic engagement and civil nuclear cooperation. And it comes from Ambassador Ronan Sen on the 4th of March, and he said, quote, "It has freed India-U.S. relations from the baggage of the past. You can't overestimate its importance, both in terms of symbolism and substance. The deal had opened the door to new opportunities ranging from cooperation in fighting climate change, and nuclear nonproliferation to trade and investment. And I believe that's basically true. But it ain't going to happen unless you have to, as someone said, this relationship is not on autopilot. It cannot go forward unless it is tended to. And that, it seems to me, is a basic difference in terms of dealing with emerging markets as opposed perhaps to the kinds of relationships we have with Europe and with Canada. It has to happen day by day, and there has to be the kinds of attentions to the knitting in order to make that happen.
Okay, for the interest of time, why don't we group a few questions together? So, do we have any other questions? Okay, sure.
Bob Hathaway here at the center. Ray, I think you demonstrated to others why Kent and I and also the rest of the Wilson Center community have been so pleased to have you here. It's an exceptionally good presentation, and believe me, I've sat through about 500 of them here, so I know what I'm talking about. I will note, however, that I'm still waiting for that case of wine. I want to ask you about the Indian American community and its role in both the economic and the political side of your story. You and I, of course, go back to a time when we remember the community was really non-existent, at least on a political side. We've also seen it really come of age and exercise a political clout, which in part, and to an important degree, is a function of its economic clout. How does the community fit into your story? And specifically, I'd be interested in your thoughts, both on the contributions that the community is making today on the issues that you're dealing with, but also I'd be interested in your thoughts, if you have any, on the limitations of their influence.
I think it's an excellent question, and with or without the wine, it's an excellent question. As I tried to point out, when we put together a coalition for partnership with India, we knew that Indian American community had to be a key part of that. 3 legs to the stool. 1, business, economic relations. 2, Indian Americans. And 3, the policy community, people, some of whom are here and represented. Those were the 3 important parts. And I want to give credit particularly to my good friend Swadesh Chatterjee and the U.S.-India Friendship Council, who was my partner, really, in terms of the Indian American part of this. There were many others on the Indian American side, but Swadesh really was a stalwart. I think that the question of what happens in the community and what impact it is a very interesting one. And it has both great upsides and it has some limitations. And this is not, of course, at all limited to the Indian American community. I think we see this in each of our relationships. We are a group from many one, e pluribus unum, and we get more pluribus than unum a lot of times. And that happens whether you're talking about Israel and Middle East policy, or what you're talking about in Eastern Europe. But there is no question, with about 2.4 million people, citizens of the United States now, with the highest per family income of any ethnic group in the United States, and a great interest in these issues which affect the dignity, particularly of India, and by extension those of Indian origin. It is a very important factor. I think that one of the things that I will try to bring out in my book, which may not be recognized is that there is a very strong economic relationship component to the effectiveness of the Indian American community. There was a study that shows that in a certain period of time, about 7 out of 10 of the startups in Silicon Valley, this is in the heyday of what was happening in information technology, were Indian American started up. I mean, they were that. That was the entrepreneurial. And when you look at the whole question of trade and services, and you look at those companies, you will find that the Indian side of it is often linked to the Indian American community in terms of a business that was started here and then used resources out of Bangalore or Pune or wherever to make it happen. So I think it's absolutely fundamental. I think that there is a question in terms of how the Indian American community can get together in a positive manner to affect what happens in policy. What happened when the civil nuclear is that for the generation of Indian Americans who were born in India and came here, this was an absolute no-brainer, and there was complete unanimity. And among the Indian American community, there is not often unanimity about anything. In fact, it's been said, where 2 or 3 are gathered together, you have 2 or 3 lawsuits. That has been the history, and you just look at the professional organizations around in terms of what's happened. But they did come together, and it made a huge, huge difference in terms of what happens for some of these reasons. Now, I'm not so sure what happens after that. As you may know, there was one recently, there has been some agitation in the Indian American community about what was called the Biden-Lugar bill. I guess it's now Kerry in regard to aid to Pakistan, which I view as, not just because I'm good friends with a lot of people working on it, but I view as a very positive kind of approach, particularly in contrast to simply the military equipment aid kind of approach which we've had too often in the past with Pakistan. And so you have, though, some who are still in the Indian American community say, well, we got to oppose it. If it's good for Pakistan, it's bad for India, and therefore it's got to be done. And I think that's very unfortunate. As I say, this is nothing which is unique to the Indian American community. You see it in each of our lobbying efforts. And I think the challenge before the Indian American community now is to obtain some cohesiveness or continuous cohesiveness in regard to it, and then to be able to, among the members of the community, to react more in terms of what happens on a policy basis and how it really works in, because as many of the people in this room know, I mean, just a knee-jerk reaction on any of it is not going to get it done. So I think that it's great in terms of the contributions that Indian Americans have made to the United States. I know I was with President Clinton at one time when he said about a particular Indian who had immigrated to the United States that he had done more for the United States than the United States ever did for him. So I think it's true that there is a huge contribution which has been made and can be made, but the community itself has to do a lot of introspection, and I think that they will be I think this civil nuclear has given the basis for how it should be done, really. But whether now it'll be necessary to take that, it's just like any of these others. It's going to take constant minding to make it the kind of positive force it should be.
Well, unfortunately, the clock has just struck 5:24, so we're going to have to wrap up. But please join me in giving another round of applause for Ray Vickery. Thanks a lot for coming, and we're adjourned.